Today we're talking about the goddess that I've received plenty of questions about since the patch came out, and that is Freya. Freya in the last patch was completely reverted from her rework, so she has her old abilities back, meaning that her 1 is again a melee enhancement for multiple hits or an additional enhancement for a 2, which is no longer a toggle but instead a pulse that lasts for a while and gives her range attacks, and outside of that she has close range attacks. And while she hypothetically went back to her old self, this doesn't necessarily mean that she will feel the same way as before due to the massive amount of item changes that we had since Freya was in her old state, especially 2 items that are very useful for Freya as well. So today we're gonna look at some of those items, some interactions and mechanics, and we're also going to look at her current performance based on data for both casual and ranked that we have already. Let's begin with the items. So the first item that I want to discuss is lifesteal options for Freya. Now, of course, you have the option to go into Pythagoras Peace, but I would argue that there is usually something better for her, depending on what your exact goals are. But outside of that, there is something specifically for Freya that is worth keeping in mind. And that is that she is the only god now, I think, in the game that has built-in direct lifesteal as a stat in her passive. And this is interesting because around the time that Typhoons Fang came out, I think certain passives were changed specifically for that, so that wouldn't be an issue. Not quite sure if this was for Anubis or who it was exactly for, but Freya now has this interaction with Typhoons Fang again. Ao Kuang may have been another one of those gods. And that means that she may actually benefit more from Typhoons Fang than Bancroft's Talon. And Bancroft's Talon is what we usually see on her because it's just the item to rush when it comes to mages that box to some degree. But with Bancroft's Talon we have between 100 and 200 power depending on our health. We also have 30 to 50% lifesteal. With Typhoons Fang on the other hand, we consistently, due to her passive, have 140 power. That's of course closer to 100 than to 200, but I personally prefer consistent power a lot because especially with a god like Freya, ideally you want to avoid taking damage in the first place. You also consistently have 42% lifesteal if we translate over the additional lifesteal effect from Typhoons Fang. So that means you will generally have consistently higher lifesteal with this, though on the other hand, of course, lifesteal is more useful when you are on lower health as well. While Typhoons Fang is a little bit more expensive, it's basically just 30 power less than a fully stacked Book of Thoth, with significantly more lifesteal attached to it. For both, it's also worth noting that Freya's 2 counts as an AoE attack, and therefore the benefit from lifesteal for that particular aspect of the damage is significantly lower. Of course, Typhoons Fang is also a little bit more expensive, so it's a choice to make. I personally like Typhoons also for the option that you can later consider another lifesteal item along with it, which will then also get additional power. So for example, if you build Pythagoras Peace later in the build, then you will get 118 power and insane amounts of lifesteal, though that can of course be countered by anti-heal. So a choice worth considering at least. Which one is your preference is up to you if you're more somebody who feels like they get low while boxing often, or if you're someone who just wants more consistent damage output. For calculations in my next video about Freya, where I specifically talk about many builds in much detail, I will be focusing on Typhoons because it's just more consistent DPS. And then we have another old question that now comes up again, and that is which penetration items work with Freya? And the answer is yes for everything. Demonic Grip will work with Freya. It used to do that before and it still does. It's simply a basic attack. So with your first hit, you apply the first stack and so on. And with Spear of the Magus, it's the same situation. Now the question here is, of course, if you're using the 2 and the 1 together, will that be 2 stacks of Spear of the Magus? And the answer to that is no, because the additional damage effects from the 2 and the 1 are actually combined when both are activated, meaning you will only get the extra stacks from 1 hit or 1 ability basically. They count as 1 ability, which also makes for some other interesting interactions. And both Demonic Grip and Spear of the Magus stack as well, so you can get a lot of protection shred against any target really very quickly. That means if you want to min-max your damage output, you use the first basic attack, either if you have Demonic or Spear of the Magus, with only your 2 active, because the 1 duration is slightly shorter and it will still match exactly with the duration of the 2, or the 2 might even run a little bit longer. And that way you not only apply the slow, but you also apply the first protection reduction already and then deal higher damage afterwards. That is of course for targets that you can't burst down in 3 shots or something anyways. And that brings us to another interesting item interaction. If you remember a video that I made earlier this year where I compared Shermans Ring and Spear of Desolation, I basically came to the conclusion that with almost any god, Shermans Ring is just not worth it when compared to Spear of Desolation. Of course, you always have the option to build both, but when looking at your best value for one of those damage items, then Spear of Desolation pretty much always came out on top, even though Shermans Ring had the requirement to stack it in the first place. For Freya, however, it was worth taking another look at this because she has the option to throw many basic attacks, making the usefulness of Shermans Ring over time higher, and she also utilizes other penetration items very effectively already. So I tested this with Shermans Ring first, and here are the stats for the first hit where Shermans Ring would not be applied yet. It applies after the first hit, even if you use the 1 and 2. So you see the total damage value here of the basic attack, the 1 and the 2 combined, is 254. Then we have the same thing when Shermans Ring is procced, and here the damage output is 278. This is of course only after the first hit. With Spear of Desolation, the damage output is 277 with every single hit. So if we don't have any pen items yet, then Spear of Desolation will still end up being higher damage overall because the first hit with Shermans Ring subtracts so much damage upfront that it can't really make up for that. But if we have our double penetration items, the Spear of the Magus and Demonic Grip, against a base protection target, then things look different, because the first hit with Shermans Ring will already deal 459 damage here, and with the proc it deals 505 damage, while Spear of Desolation, due to its lower power, only deals 453 damage, and because you have so much pen, you can't really offset that in other ways. So I think with how easy it is for Freya to apply various levels of penetration, Shermans Ring can very much be a useful investment on her when compared to Demonic Grip. If it's useful overall is something we'll discuss in the next video, because it has quite a few competing items, because there are a lot of items that are interesting for Freya. The same tip from the penetration applies again here, by the way. If you want to maximize your damage, then you only use the 2 on your first basic attack, so the slow gets applied and the Shermans Ring gets applied, and then afterwards you use the 1 so that it gets the amplified damage from the start. Another item that I thought was very interesting is Staff of Myrrdin. If you're not familiar with this relatively new item yet, Staff of Myrrdin allows you to use an ability twice after you use your ultimate, once with reduced damage output. And there's some really interesting stuff going on with Staff of Myrrdin for Freya specifically. So what you can do is you can use your 2 and your 1, and then you use your ultimate, and afterwards your 2 will be off cooldown already. So you use your 2 again, and now you will have reduced damage. You will have the reduced basic attack damage and reduced damage from the 2 itself. Both counts towards the ability here, apparently counts towards the 2, so both gets reduced damage. But something didn't add up to me here. So the values that you see here is the normal damage. The basic attack is 79 damage, the 2 is 67 damage, the 1 on its own is 111 damage, and if you activate both the 1 and the 2, then it's 178 damage. So you just add them together. Makes perfect sense. The reduced damage values were 55 for the basic attack and 47 for the 2. Both reduced, that makes sense. The 1 hypothetically would not be reduced, so it would be 111 damage still. And what happens if we activate the 1? We still get our basic attack damage of 55, so that remains reduced. But the combined damage, the other damage that pops up, which again is just one number, it just gets added together for the 2 and the 1, is not reduced anymore. It's 178 again. This is probably because by using the 2 and the 1, they basically get turned into a new ability. They don't count as the 2 and they don't count as the 1. They count as the 5, I guess. The 2 and the 1 together, but we also have banished, so we can't call it the 3. So this can be utilized to increase the damage output when using Staff of Myrrdin, and then afterwards you can use your 2 again, because it doesn't have a cooldown at that point. The question is it really useful to even be able to use your ability that often, or invest into Staff of Myrrdin for that, when you can also just invest into Chronos Pendant and basically have no downtime on your 2 anyways. The downtime then remains like 1 basic attack with 30% CDR, so it's hardly noticeable in most situations anyways. Rod of Tahuti also functions as intended. It increases the magical power once you drop below 50%, and that is of course very impactful. Now if you want to know more about itemization for Freya, then I will have another video coming up in the next days where I will discuss everything from starting items to item choices in late game in depth, so feel free to click the sub button if you haven't yet to stay tuned for that. In this video we're also quickly going to look at her current performance, because that's very interesting. In Conquest, in Casual, her performance doesn't look that much better than before. We can see that she is at spot number 88 in terms of win rate with a 47.78% win rate, so really she's got a rough time still. But CasualSmite.com now also has ranked statistics, which allows us to see how she's performing there, and we see a very interesting pattern. If you look at her bronze win rate, that's actually at 34.91%, and she's spot number 97. So she is definitely not doing very well with new players, and there is a decent number of matches played at this point. Like, it's not massive, but 300 something. So it's not like this is just a super small player pool. People in lower divisions just really seem to struggle with Freya. But then if we look at Diamond, we see the opposite. We see her win rate skyrocket up to 64.71%. That still doesn't make her the highest win rate in Diamond, because the number of games there is also relatively low and fluctuates a lot. But we can definitely see a pattern here of her improving a lot with higher ranks when people know how to play her, how to play her safer as well, I guess, and also how to build her better. And I would still argue that based on the popular items, a lot of people haven't quite figured out how to build her best after the changes. So as I said, that is what I'll help you with in an upcoming video, so you can maybe improve with Freya a little bit more. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth out.